This film was made to acknowledge the military service of my whānau. My mother Mary Melrose and father Dennis Joyce met when they were both in service for the Royal New Zealand Navy. Mary was in the Women's Royal Navy Service in the Stewards branch. She was a boarder at Elizabeth House and served in the Navy for 4 years over 2 stints. In 1968, the Malaysian Communists, under their ethnic Chinese leader Chin Peng, declared war on the Malaysian government. This armed struggle is generally known as the Second Emergency, following on from the original Malayan Emergency. At the time, Chin Peng was feared almost as much as Osama bin Laden in more recent times, and earned the reputation of being Britain's enemy number 1 in Southeast Asia. Dennis served on the Royal New Zealand Navy ships Otago and Waikato as a junior seaman sonar controller. The New Zealand Navy patrolled the Malacca Straits for weapons, smugglers and communist patrol boats. Dennis had 4 deployments between 1966 and 1972. During World War II, my grandfather Basil was in the 3 Division of the New Zealand Army. In November 1942, New Zealand troops began arriving in New Caledonia and then were sent to protect the Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands, arriving there in late August 1943. The men were shocked at the appearance of the island. Intense shelling had stripped the trees of their leaves and snapped their trunks. Bodies of Japanese and United States troops were buried in makeshift graves. The following month, New Zealanders landed on Mono Island. This was the first opposed amphibious landing by New Zealand forces since Gallipoli. They successfully took the island from the Japanese defenders. After the war, Basil married my grandmother and moved to Putoruru in the Waikato, where he ran a milk truck for 10 years before becoming a male nurse at the Tokunui Mental Health Hospital in Te Awamutu. Jack Melrose was in the 21st Battalion. It is an infantry battalion of the New Zealand Military Forces, which served during the Second World War. The battalion saw action in Greece, Crete, North Africa and Italy before it was disbanded in December 1945. Although none of my whānau have ever really talked much about the war, I remember my grandfather telling me about a tank battle against the German 2nd Panzer Tank Division, one they eventually lost. They were forced to retreat under the cover of their own artillery fire. 40 New Zealand soldiers were killed and more than 250 caught and imprisoned by the German army. After returning from the war, Jack moved to Te Awamutu, where he started his own building company and married my grandmother. He was very influential in the community, serving on the boards of several community organisations. This is my great-grandfather George Baines Melrose. He was a member of the New Zealand Expeditionary Force who fought in the First World War. The soldiers of the NZEF were diverted to defend the Suez Canal in northern Egypt, whilst en route to the Western Front in 1915. In 1917 he was sent to Gallipoli in Turkey, where he fought alongside our Australian cousins in the ANZAC Corps, a division of the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force. Of the 14,000 New Zealanders who fought at Gallipoli, 2,779 died and more than 4,000 were wounded in battles. George was one of these wounded and was eventually sent back to New Zealand in 1917. After recovering, he saw out the war as a manager of the prison farm on Auckland's Motuhi Island, where the famous German naval officer Count Felix von Luckner was held and then sensationally escaped from. After the war, George returned to Te Awamutu and became involved in the community. He was hugely influential in petitioning the government to build Te Awamutu College, who, in return, honoured his efforts by carving him into one of the po that hold up the roof of the school's marae wharenui. A great honour indeed for a Pākehā man. Te Wherewhero, who would become the first Māori king, was born in the Waikato towards the end of the 18th century. He was the eldest son of a Waikato warrior chief, Te Rauanganga of Ngāti Kora. He belonged to the senior chiefly line of Ngāti Mahuta and was descended from the captains of the Tainui and Te Arawa Waka. He was a highly respected chief and was heavily involved in the New Zealand musket wars that took place between various North Island iwi in the 1820s and early 1830s. He was crowned Potato Te Wherowhero in 1958 and died 2 years later on June 25 at Ngaruawahia. Many tribes gathered to pay their last tributes to him. Although Te Wherowhero only had 4 official wives, he had fathered other children, including Mai Tipuna, Iri Hapete Te Paia, affectionately known as Pete, who herself was Ngāti Awanuiarangi iwi from the Whakatane area,